Yes,
that's a very difficult question, especially when the Gini coefficient has been moved. So probably the exam paper that I have about where I prepared for an elephant. So the only bridge I have to use is that the worm has it's elongated like the trunk of an elephant. So I cannot answer the question of inequality because it continues. In fact, it is getting worse. However, since 2001, to try and deal with these issues of poverty, because inequality and poverty are related, South Africa introduced a range of measures, particularly to look at the plight of the poor. In terms of access to water, potable water, 6 kiloliter free basic water per household per month, 50 kilowatts free basic electricity per household per month, on sewerage 50 rands per month, and then 50 rands for solid waste, as interventions that were introduced to mitigate not so much inequality, but poverty. And you can see in the results in the statistics that inequality, the Gini has remained where it is. But when you look at the impact of that on poverty, particularly between 2001 and 2011, you see a rapid reduction of poverty in all the municipalities in South Africa, 252 of them, especially if you look at that from the multidimensional point of view. But you also see serious reversal from 2011 to 2016, whereby of the 252 municipalities, 82 of them have reversed. So the question is, what happened between then and you can see that actually continuing to reverse, because even between 2018 and 2019, the number of households that were accessing this basic guaranteed rights have actually decreased significantly since that time. In the meantime, the Statistician General, my successor, of course, we issued, when I was there, we issued inflation adjusted poverty lines to which the government has to live up to by providing the kinds of interventions such as social grants that are inflation adjusted to those. And as we speak now in 2022, those lines for the food poverty line, that's about 500 rands, and for the lower bound poverty line, that comes to about 700 rands, and for the upper bound, it's about 1,400. So will government live up to that? It's yet to be seen. If it doesn't, it means that the living conditions will actually decline. So basically, we bring the data and bring those together with policy to see whether the interventions will actually materialize. Well, we've had COVID, we've had a lot of other things in South Africa. The High Commissioner knows all these difficulties. Certainly, the living conditions in South Africa are deteriorating very, 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 very fast. So, what could be the bigger question? I think the bigger question is in the space of our policy designs, is how in the design of policy we are systematic. It's not so much about, yes, the statistics are important, but adopting a very systematic process around design is very, very crucial. And I think that's where we fail. Yes, we have South Africa 2030, Vision 2030. We have all these countries saying we have this vision, that vision. But these are nice words, unfortunately. Until you define those nice words in terms of policies, until you define those scenarios into the future in the form of what are the set of policies that define these particular scenarios. Because a high road scenario, a middle road scenario, and a low road scenario, each one of them have specific policies. And you can only become intentional when you quantify those scenarios, following the laws of motion of economics. And that is where the eye of the needle functions well. And you will make your choices for that. And therefore, what am I saying? Imagine that you must have scenarios. You must then define those scenarios in terms of a set of policies. You must then quantify those policies so that the critical choices can be made. And then manage, communicate, and everything. We only stop at the nice words of the scenarios. Baragwara, it's Naina walk and all that. We don't go beyond that. And therefore, when we do that, we can't expect a difference. And we try to mix these policies together and think that we can average them out and achieve something. So that's where I think I've observed a major weakness sitting there as a statistician, and that's why we actually established this Economic Modeling Academy to try and bring to bear the idea of setting scenarios that are quantified, modeled, looked into the future in order to resolve problems. Answering that question is very difficult. And it goes back to the creation of the United Nations system in 1945 and the associated institutions of the IMF and the World Bank. And if you think about the history there, Maynard Keynes was supposed to be in that discussion. He was not able to. Instead, there are others who were in there who actually embedded a particular policy position towards what should happen post 1945. And since then, we've seen, of course, the Cold War came about. And 1988-89, a unipolar world emerged with the dismantling of Russia and so on. And if you think about that time, South Africa also managed to be free because, in part, because a unipolar world had emerged. With it emerged specific policies that were largely driven by their intellectual behind them, Milton Friedman. And in this, he generally created free market fundamentalism, which is actually what we have followed with structural reforms. And if you think about the Lagos Plan of Action, it was actually fighting these structural reforms that were actually announced before 1979, thereabout, which introduced things like user pay in education and so on. And since then, the African education system got broken. So the creation of the working poor has come about through that entire process. If you think about Milton Friedman going to Russia, talking to Gorbachev, Russia reversed its progress in education and other things. It's only regaining itself now. He tried to go to China, and then was almost 19 that age. But he said, no, China has always had its own markets. And the markets in China are about using that which is heavy to shoot at that which is light. And an ever normal grammar, which was a philosophy of Qing dynasty, 5000 BC. And when you see the path China has followed, has been that one of actually getting a particular market system with China's characteristics. The rest of us in South Africa, we followed a different path.
Economists.
Yes. And the economists have said this, the hidden hand of the market, which determines, yes. So this is the problem that we have in Africa, of this particular invisible hand. And Greenspan, when we were at the IMF, at the conference, was saying, you know, he made a mistake. He had retired by that time from as the banker of the US, that he thought, reflecting on the 2008 financial crisis, he thought the free market will ensure that the bad loans will actually go to the wall and the good loans will survive. No. The investment bankers mix both the bad and the good and plunge the world into that kind. So when we think about this free market and that it is free, this is where the politics have power, but then they exercise that power very wrongly. Human agency is at the center of change. And free markets, do they? I don't think they do. And they've landed us here, where you find that we have created the waging pool.
Yes.
It's an intentional creation.
Definitely food for thought. So the last question was about governance in West Africa, in the former French colonies, and the unconstitutional changes of governments there, and then interventions from outside. The question was open to all of you. So I don't know, Professor Kizami, do you want to answer it since you're dealing with policy, or Dr. Obalan, do you want to answer that? You already said it's geopolitics. That's your answer. All right.
Yes, I think the popular revolt in West Africa has been well documented over time. That it is boiling over now. It's a Sankara moment having come to maturity. And certainly it is creating this conundrum that the African leaders agreed to, that military coups are not allowed on the continent once people have been elected correctly, then there shouldn't be military coups. I think there's a prior question to that. That what does it mean? What does this democracy mean? And Professor Weiwei, the Chinese ambassador, who would say that in China, you have to have planned a municipality with 100 million people before you rise to power. I think the central question is, what is the meaning of democracy? And if you read Socrates and Confucius argue about meritocracy, that Socrates says he believes in democracy, but not the type of democracy where everybody can vote. Why would you allow yourself, I mean, if you have to go to a surgeon to operate on your brain, it will not pay anybody who does that. Why do you leave an important issue of democracy, of politics, to anybody to operate on your bodies? Like, would you allow anybody that comes across you and you allow them to operate on your brain? And you are saying democracy works like anybody operating on your brain. And we have allowed it. And that's what Socrates was saying. He was not against people voting, but he was against those who do not have the ability and the higher level of social consciousness to actually lead or even vote. Because this corresponds with Lenin in 1920 when he was addressing the Bolsheviks. He said there are three things that we have in the Russian Revolution. And those are the enemies. Communist pomposity within which communists articulate the slogans. That was what he was against. Illiteracy, that a person is illiterate lives out of politics. And corruption. And those three things are things that are facing us today. And he was arguing that anybody who has to participate in a democratic process has to have a higher cultural conscience. And therefore, it is that which Socrates was arguing about. It is that which Confucius was arguing about. And in fact, it's probably what the Chinese mean by saying selection and election as a process of getting democracy going. So you select the best. So that, I think, this is the problem we are in at the moment. And thinking ahead means you have to assemble all kinds of thoughts and model that future. And the history of modeling has been probably driven by things you can quantify. And modeling in the area of development has been concentrated on the economic side. So econometrics has been a fairly well developed science, and it deals with those things that economically you can count. So the CGE model is basically that. So you look at where will your GDP be, where will your debt to GDP ratio be, where will your growth will be. So prices and growth and all those are concentrated on this. The key issues that we are facing are not in that model. Like unemployment, poverty, and inequality. To impute those, you run small studies that are not integrated in that model. So when you run that model, it cannot tell you the impact on employment, impact on inequality, and impact on all these things that we are talking about. So you are facing a Mulana situation where Mulana was walking around and the friend asks him, Mulana, what's the problem? Mulana tells him, I have lost my coin. So he asks, Mulana, where did you lose your coin? He says, I don't know. If I knew, I would have gone there. Then he asks him, why are you looking for it here? He says, that's where there is light. So econometrics is based on our knowledge systems. And it's not outside. The things that are outside, such as poverty, corruption, and so on, are not easy to quantify. Now, Friedman and them created the basis for the CGE model, which measures economics in terms of what I've spoken about, growth, which was the main thing, because the GDP, national account, was a product of the end of the World War, and the world wanted to understand the macroeconomic imbalances so that the war can be stopped. Because both the First and the Second World War were a result of the macroeconomic imbalances. So GDP the first commission that was established by the United Nations, one of the two was the Statistics Commission, and central to that was the National Account. So the National Account has been at the forefront of the statistics system at the UN, not focusing on the main things like poverty, inequality, and so on. So now there are models that are built that actually show the impacts of macroeconomic policies on poverty, inequality, and multidimensional poverty. So those must be the objective outcomes against which then we can actually say, well, how do these get affected by the macroeconomic policies? That is there. There was a study more recently where at the BRICS summit 3 weeks ago, where they actually looked at what corruption, but unfortunately, corruption indicators have not become part of the rubric of statistics in statistics organizations. But they use Corruption Watch to regress that and find what actually happens to corruption. And the results are quite promising. That where there is less corruption, results are much, much better. And we compare different countries, South Africa, China, Brazil, and so on. And the results are quite clear. Thanks.